crossed into the center of Sawgore. Past the third set of lights in one blinking yellow, he spotted the Shadowland Booth Library. Looked like an old hospital, the kind they used to keep insane people in during the turn of the century. The last time he was here was on a 6th grade field trip. The place seemed a lot bigger than he remembered. Probably because his reason for visiting back then was not nearly as ominous. His very life, his mortality, depended on finding answers. If he was going to fight Zack, first he had to know who or what he was fighting. Scooter parked the bike in the back parking lot in the far corner. The parking lot was well lit. Too well lit. He scoured the ground and found a rock. He threw it at the bulb of the light pole. It missed. He found another rock. Tried again. Missed again. He picked up a rock. Scooter pulled back to hurl it, but hesitated. Instead, he centered the rock in his open palm. The same as he'd done with his dagger on the bureau, he concentrated. The rock twitched. Scooter squinted, picturing the rock enveloped in a gaseous fume. A physical manifestation of his thoughts. An energy he felt roaring through and around him. It was an energy he felt ever since Amy, Zack, had blown him. Ever since he'd sworn his allegiance. To what? To who? Scooter returned his focus to the stone. The rock followed Scooter's silent command, floating from his open hand. Casually, the stone floated until it hovered inches from the top of the light pole. Scooter closed his open hand, curling his fingers into his palm, nails biting into his skin. Scooter harbored a great power. A power that did not scare him, as he thought it should, but empowered him. In fact, the realization of this gift was comforting. He felt as if he found something that had been hiding from him all his life. A gift he never knew enough to even look for. With Shane's bike hidden in the shadows of the broken light, Scooter dashed toward the ancient building. In the pitch blackness of the night, he ran his palms along the rough brick until he found glass. Scooter pushed and nudged, but the window didn't budge. He made quick work of the window, running the tape diagonal in a giant X. He ran the tape horizontally at various heights and did the same vertically. With a rock the size of a baseball, he tapped the center of the window. The glass gently spiderwebbed, and with controlled and steady hands, Scooter peeled the tape away with crumbling glass. Some smaller shards scattered onto the ground, but most stuck to the bands of tape. Scooter lowered the mass to the ground. He panned the darkness. No movement. No lights from neighboring establishments or houses had turned on, and the nearby streets were dead quiet. But sirens could be heard in the far distance. Hopefully they weren't en route to his location. A dog could be heard barking from a close residential area, but for the most part the library was nestled far enough off the main streets, and plenty of large trees on the property aided in concealing his activities. Up until this point in his life, the most deviant thing he'd done was stealing Amy's panties and throwing rocks at the derelict Coca-Cola plant's windows last summer when him and Zach had walked the train tracks from Buckeye toward Runwich. But neither of those things were truly criminal. Not like breaking and entering or desecrating graves. Scooter couldn't even believe he'd had the balls to set out on this insanely criminal quest. And even if he didn't get nabbed by the cops, Shane was going to beat him to a bloody stump. No, he wouldn't. Shane would never bother him again. A dark, pulsing vein of energy charged through his body. And though he could not actually see it, he knew it was purple lightning dancing through every vital organ and artery of his body. When he'd made that oath to Zach, he'd been gifted some strange occult power. And even if he had to break into a guarded government compound, he had to figure out what Zach had done to him. And how. And if there was any way out of it. After slipping his backpack on, he gripped the window ledge and heaved himself into the library. He was in. No alarm sounded, which was encouraging, unless the alarm was silent. He'd come this far. No turning back now. A strange combination of scents like dried cloves, pipe tobacco, and aged dust haunted the library. Dull, flickering lights from the fire alarm stationed throughout the building blinked at him like the many eyes of curious creatures. A long corridor made from floor-to-ceiling high bookshelves led him toward the front of the library. The large, wide oaken door that led into the basement archives was a foreboding beast. Elaborate tapestry of medieval creature, a chimera, was carved into the thick wood. The doorknob itself was a heavy iron hoop. Holding his breath, praying no alarm went off, he pulled the door open. And opened into a large, round room. The ceiling had to be 2 stories high. Spines of books lined the shelves by the thousands, all various colors, sizes, and in various conditions of quality. 4 long rectangular tables occupied the center of the room, and a couple glass box-shaped quiet rooms were built into the corners. Cushioned armchairs speckled the room close to the walls, as did small end tables with table lamps. Several computers were set up, but Scooter didn't want a chance turning them on, fearing the light shining through the library windows would alert the locals to his intrusion. This library was as old as Joseph Rollins himself. The Dewey Decimal System was still in use. And Scooter located the drawer of cards he needed and found the name. Rollins. Joseph. Non-fiction archives. Scooter closed the drawer quietly. The basement yielded that classic scent of old paper and woodsy residues, but cleaner and more refined than the upstairs. 2 small round tables were in the center of the room, and each hosted a lamp with crimson-red shades. Since there were no windows down here, Scooter felt it was acceptable to turn on the lamp so that he could see. After panning up and down the shelves for a long, nervous moment, he spotted it. 3rd row from the top. Standing on a rolling ladder, he began to climb. Ecstasy of unlawful existentialism. "6 years, 2 weeks, 5 days. That's how long it had been since Rodney Bowden had drank anything stronger than black coffee. And he hadn't had the urge since. Even though he took the back roads home, he kept seeing the neon signs in his mind, and the frothy golden foam of an icy cold draft, or that crystal clear shot of silver tequila. Back in the war, they'd seen some bad stuff when out in the shit, humping around the jungles after hearing local tales about the Quong Bone, malicious demon spirit that took the form of a hybrid monstrosity with a deer's horns and legs, the head of a gorilla, and the tail of a bull. The locals all claimed it would appear in the jungles at night in search of a soul to take and store inside an aberrant tree that grew in the underworld. Some of his fellow soldiers claimed they'd seen Quong Bone. Rodney had seen the stare in those men's eyes. Hollow, distant and frightened. Rodney had never believed that the Quong Bone was real. It was nothing but foolish folklore that the South Vietnamese kept alive, maybe to scare the children from running off into the dangerous jungles. But after the last few days' hell, Rodney was now giving a good look out the window at the gloomy curtain of thick and tangled wad of woods that skirted the sides of the gravel-topped road, and wondered in all earnest just what the hell could really be lurking in the darkest corners of this world, of this very town. What was stalking his town? A deranged psychopath like Charles Frederick Albright, the eyeball killer, who'd roamed around the Houston area in the early 90s? Well, Rodney couldn't rightfully remember Charles Albright having a mechanical spider as a partner in crime, but there was already 2 blood-soaked residential crime scenes, and now one right in the heart of Buckeye at Roxy's Diner. In the back of his skull was a sledgehammer pounding of frustration, desperation, and exasperation all melded together. One throbbing thought kept chipping away at his resolve. How the hell could he do anything about it without a stiff drink? Good Lord knew he couldn't even listen to country music anymore. At least not the good old stuff. And all that new crap was just garbage. Instead, he kept the radio on NPR and currently listened to the best of car talk, Click and Clack talking about rebuilding the carburetor for a 1982 Chevy. He hoped and prayed that Connie had taken one of her painkillers and gone to bed by now. The woman always wanted to stay up till he got home. God bless her soul. She was in no shape to be keeping up late hours. The doctor said she needed all the rest she could get. The damn woman would see worry in his tired eyes the moment she laid sight upon him. She would end up dragging it all up out of him. Bless that GRIT heart of hers. Wasn't much he could tell her anyhow, because he didn't know much more than the scared patrons of Roxy's. But Connie would make her way into the kitchen and whip up a fresh pan of hot water cornbread and pour 2 glasses of milk and tea. And she wouldn't let him be till he said he had it all under control. That's what she always did when he had a troublesome case. But this was a lot bigger pot of troubles than he'd been strapped with. Buckeye. It was where his daddy and mama was born, and where they raised him and his younger brother Chet. But he couldn't ever remember anything as terrible as this. Not since the Valles butcherings back in '82. He'd just been a bushy-tailed deputy under Sheriff Randy Hopkins' guidance. Connie had been healthy and mobile back then, and even worked a shift at Roxy's as a cook. Roxy used to say that woman could make the finest cornbread and a mean jambalaya, too. But this wasn't the same old town he'd grown up in. The First Baptist Church on the corner of Midway and Laneford, where he and Connie had gotten hitched, was now a closed-down skating rink. Too damn close to Carrion Lane. But keeping a bunch of trashy, low-life thugs like the Carrion Creepers in check was a lot damn easier than tracking down a giant robotic spider and a possible cultist on the loose. He'd figured the satanic worshipping thing had been a trend of the old days when them rock people like E16 and the Motley Crue were big. Shouldn't be too hard to spot a long red-haired youth wearing green leather and carrying a sword. Unless he'd done wised up and got himself a new wardrobe. Maybe a haircut. Tonight he'd get himself a good sleep. First thing in the morning, he was paying a visit to the Valles farm. And they weren't going to buy him off like they'd done with Randy, Mayor Stonehenge, and Judge Bullock back in the day. He'd have that place pulled apart like the chickens they raised. I'm home. He peeled off his uniform shirt and set it next to the orange house phone. Maybe she'd recorded American Idol on that newfangled TiVo, since he'd missed it when it originally aired because of that damn Carmen Valles. Connie probably waited up for him so they could catch those guys and girls as they gave it their all to become the next stars based on popular demand. Heck, he'd watch it with her before they go to bed, no matter how tired or baffled he was. To hell with lost time or jailbreaks. When Rodney stepped into his wife's room, he froze solid as an ice sculpture. Sitting in the cushioned chair next to Connie, the cushioned chair he always maintained after his shift, was a pale-skinned man in odd attire.
Oh, Rodney, Cinder is such a hoot. Why haven't you ever introduced him to me before?
Rodney blinked. He looked to his wife, whom he's loved since their youth. The 1960s. Good times. Crazy times. But they've been strong. Then he looked to the strange character sitting next to his sick wife. She's happy. She's joyful. Who in the hell are you?
Rodney, what's wrong with you? We were merely enjoying tea.
How'd you get into my house? The stranger rose from the cushioned seat. He clapped a hand over Rodney's shoulder as though they were age-old friends. It is perfectly all right and understandable, dear Sheriff of Buckeye, but I assure you that I only bring goodness to you and yours. He began to usher Rodney out of the room. Connie needs her sleep now. Please, she's weak. We must discuss a mutual connection. I don't even know you. How'd you get into my house? Connie is very sick. She's going to die soon. But I like her. How sad an autumn breeze would blow for her. But yet a summer breeze could lift her spirit high. Stepping backward, Rodney drew his weapon, aimed at the intruder. The gun. Such a troublesome bauble of your world, and a crude instrument of primitive invention. Waste no precious time in recovering your trinkets, Sheriff of Buckeye, for it won't do any good. Rodney leaned his back against a linen closet. He lowered his gun. My daddy wasn't wrong, was he? He said there were strange things out in this world, but hell, I just figured he drank too much moonshine and got his head hit too many times in prison. Connie is very sick. Rodney suddenly trembled and fell to his knees. My wife. My Connie. Oh, God, she ain't got long, does she? And you. Are you an angel? You can help her? You dropped the charges against Carmen Valles, and your kind Connie lives a full life. And so do you. Both of you. Forever. My people never lie. Hesitantly, Rodney pulled himself back to a full stand. You son of a bitch. Who sent you here? The Valles send you here to threaten my wife and me? Rodney raised his gun. I need you to get out of my house right now. And I don't want to ever see you anywhere near my wife ever again. Baubles and trinkets. I've dealt with primitive projectiles before, but allow me to demonstrate a feat that should prove my sincerity. From a lower pocket, he brandished a razor. My kind prefer to dispense with senseless violence. We prefer to leave those barbaric gestures to the barbaric tribes. Thus, since my kind mean you no harm, you should discard that rude instrument. I'll keep it just the same. By all means. Whatever makes you comfortable. But the conditions remain the same. Drop the charges against Carmen Valles and her supposed cohort Atticus, and Connie shall live a perfectly healthy life. Rodney cocked the hammer on the 357 Colt Python. Ah, you don't believe me yet. He pushed a sleeve of his shirt above his elbow, revealing an even paler scope of skin of a near albino. Observe. With smooth ease, he sliced his arm from wrist to elbow. Blood bloomed like a red river. Oh, Jesus! Rodney was dealing with a criminally insane individual, and this man had gotten into his house. But he couldn't shoot him. He was obviously suffering from a mental disorder or cranked up on something. A prime candidate for Eden Garden Sanitarium. Blood dripped from the man's wrist, but his facial status never changed from indifference. Rodney watched, with gun trained on the man's chest as the stranger reached into an upper breast pocket and retrieved a small vial that he emptied gingerly over his wound. The dark tea-colored fluid dribbled over the wound, coating it, bubbling like peroxide. When the bubbling subsided, there was no scar, no blood, no signs of trauma at all. Drop the charges, and I will acquire enough of the panacea for Connie to live a long and wonderful life. Cinder tipped his head forward and strolled casually out the front door. Beaded sweat rolled down Rodney's broad forehead as he braced himself against the wall. His trembling hand replaced the 357 next to the house phone. Connie could live a long and wonderful life.
We can see it afar, for the Father waits over.